And some of the papers that he wrote during that time, got acclaim, in ACCV. And then, he kind of moved into robotics and has done, a lot of cool work in robot learning. So it's a pleasure to have Dinesh with us. And, before I hand it over to Dinesh, let's also thank Tao, who has, organized this talk. So, with that, Dinesh, please take it away.
Thanks, Pratik. Thanks, Pulkit, and thank you, Tao, for the invitation and also for the kind introduction. Today I'll be talking about scaling vision-based RL for robotics. And in general, to set up towards that, kind of the larger goals that we are working towards, like many others, is towards general purpose robots. And in particular, we believe that progress in computer vision is going to be really important to do this. The way I like to think about it is that a lot of the successes of robots over the last few decades have come in controlled factory automation settings, and that larger dream of having robots around us in our homes and offices and hospitals and workplaces has still remained a dream, right? And if you think about what the differences between these settings are, there are largely fully observed and well-modeled settings on the left, whereas on the right, you have many more unknowns and many more uncertainties. And this really kind of helps you begin to think about how to think of perception's role here, because perception precisely is the extraction of information, which in a Shannonian sense is the resolution of uncertainty, right? And so here is kind of a way to kind of nail that down a little bit more is I like to think of these two driving settings, one on the left on a kind of very clear road without any traffic, where you might even be able to look at your phone. I'm not recommending this, but you might be able to look at your phone while you're driving. And the other is on a really crowded street in India where there are pedestrians and auto rickshaws and cabs and motorbikes all sharing the same road, and it's going to be really important that you stay alert at all times, right? And so the way to think of this and the standard kind of perception action loop setup is that on the left, you might be able to take one look at your environment, understand its state as 0, and then estimate an entire sequence of actions that might lead you towards wherever you want to be. So this is, and after that, you might not need to check back in with the state for some time, right? So this is what you would typically call open loop control, right? Whereas on the right, you would be much more required to stay alert. So you take one look at the environment, execute a single action that would change the state of the environment, and you would have to, again, check back in with the environment because there are many aspects of the environment outside of your control and that are not easy to predict. And so you would have to kind of repeatedly keep checking back in with the environment in this fashion. And this is what you would typically call closed loop control, right? And in both of these cases, that lower arrow that's carrying the information from the world to the agent is the perception arrow, right? It's the thing that would estimate the state of the world so that you can then determine your optimal actions. Now, the argument we're making is that as you move towards more and more complex settings, your perception action loops need to be more closed. So it's not just a binary between an open and a closed loop. They need to be more closed. And what I mean by that is that you need to have higher bandwidth perception. Right? So you need to have higher bandwidth perception. And then you also need to have somehow the ability to make judgments based on all of that information to map to the optimal complex behaviors. And so a promising approach towards this that we've been investigating is to take advantage of the advances in computer vision and reinforcement learning over the last few years, right? So many of you are probably already familiar with this, but just in case, here is a quick overview of what the reinforcement learning formalism is for perception action loops. Right? So the way you would normally think about this is that there are states that are observed by the agent, such as from a camera. Then there are actions that are executed by the agent. And the world evolves according to some transition function P of S prime given S comma A. And there is a reward associated with every such transition, SA S prime. Right. And the objective of the agent then is typically to maximize the discounted sum of reward over time. And it's going to do that by executing a good action sequence. Now, this is the usual setup for reinforcement learning. And it seems very general, and that really is also the reason that it also carries drawbacks. In particular, a common critique of reinforcement learning-based approaches is that learning is very often experience-intensive, and it requires too many trials and has to start from scratch for every new robot or task or environment. So that criticism is really what we'll be trying to address today. And so the strategy for more scalable visual RL that I'll be kind of outlining today is to build algorithms that attend to the right things. And I say right things as kind of a catch-all phrase for different kinds of attention. So in particular, you could be attending spatially to the appropriate portions of the scene for modeling them, perhaps, or you could be attending temporally to the key time instance in your observation stream, or you could be attending to the right data, right? So you might be attending to the right snippets of your past experience. And all of this has to be combined with the ability to use your data well, to squeeze the maximum juice out of your data. And so we'll be primarily looking at methods that can use offline and off-policy data well. So in particular, we'll be touching on model-based reinforcement learning, offline RL, and imitation. So this is kind of my ambition for what to talk about today. It is a little ambitious, admittedly, and we'll see what can be actually covered. So the dashed arrows are actually the portions that I might be forced to abbreviate depending on how time goes. Okay, any questions about this already? Feel free to raise questions in the chat or just unmute yourself if necessary. Okay, so the first thing that I'll talk about is focusing on the right data for imitation learning. This is work done in collaboration with Chuan Wen, Aurora Chan, Jeru Lee, and Yang Gao. So this is a collaboration also with Tsinghua University, where Yang is based. Okay, so the setup for this is that it's often obvious in many cases, in particular in partially observed settings where you might like to learn good policies, that you should have your policies depend on observation history. So if that's not immediately obvious, I like this example in the driving setting where you might be driving your car and a pedestrian that you should obviously be accounting for is not always visible to you, right? But if you are tracking your state over time, if you do have a memory and you have the ability to rely on past observations, then you have the ability to kind of guess that the pedestrian is going to be behind the car and so not accelerate as you get past the car, right? So it's obvious, therefore, that historical observations should be useful. But it turns out that many people over many years now, about 20 years, have repeatedly reported that relying on historical observations during imitation learning can sometimes actually hurt. In particular, in the driving setting is where this result has come about a lot. But we've actually verified that since in many other settings. So what I'm showing you here is a table that shows that not relying on history actually leads to much better driving performance, whereas relying on history actually might lead to better perplexity or better validation losses, right? So we'll be with this table on the next slide as well, and I'll revisit that. But really the question that we're trying to answer in this part of the talk is, why does imitation learning from observation histories sometimes perform poorly? And how can we address that? Okay, so there is a phrase for this problem that we actually came up with in a previous paper. I've been investigating this problem now for a couple of years in a variety of papers through a variety of approaches, but we've recently come up with this very simple approach to tackle this that I'm excited to tell you about today. So we call this the copycat shortcut. The idea here is that the agent, very often in these cases, when you're training the agent with behavioral cloning on the expert data for imitation learning, it learns to pay no attention at all to the environment. Instead, it just generates new actions purely based on previous actions. So here is an example of how that might happen. Let's say that your car is currently stuck at a traffic light. And the expert action is to consistently brake as long as the traffic light is red and then change to throttle at the point at which the traffic light is green. Now, if you learned a copycat policy that only relied on previous actions, in this particular case, it's an extremely simple version of relying on previous actions. It literally just repeats the expert's last action, then it would be right 3 out of 4 time steps in this visualization. And of course, you might imagine that if your car is stuck at the traffic light for a longer time stream, really almost all of those instances will be right. And really only this one instant when you're changing, the change point is actually wrong for the copycat policy, right? And so this policy, of course, is disastrous when you roll it out, but it works well on the training data, right? And that's exactly what we saw in these results that we reported from a previous paper. So what then is causing the learner to learn shortcuts? Well, I've kind of foreshadowed it on the slide, but let's think about this a little bit further from the point of view of what the behavioral cloning gloss is saying. The behavioral cloning gloss typically is set up like this. You have an imitation data set of expert trajectories Each time step from the expert trajectories is an individual sample for a supervised learning problem, and the supervised learning problem merely tries to minimize the mean squared error between the outputs of your policy and the expert actions, right? Now, of course, what happens here is that the expert actions are highly temporally correlated, and as a result, the number of change points that we saw on the previous slide, the number of those change points are extremely small compared to all the rest of the data. And so you effectively have a highly imbalanced data set, and the change points are easily underfit, and therefore the copycat policy is learned. So what's important in particular to understand is that the copycat policy really fits the training data very well, right? So let's define, for example, the optimal copycat policy as the policy that best performs the function of matching expert actions while completely ignoring the environment and attending only to past actions. So in particular, if you wrote it down as an equation, this would be the optimal policy, the optimal copycat policy. The only inputs into it are the past actions, right? Now, again, the copycats are correct most of the time on the training data. So if you think about all the different time steps involved in this process of stopping at a red light, again, we're using this kind of toy setting of stopping at a red light, but of course, this is not the only setting where it's important. So if you imagine all the instances where you're stopped at a red light and then switch to actually moving, the actions are 0 consistently for the first 3 time steps, and then 1 consistently for the next 3 time steps, corresponding to braking and throttling. And the only time step where things change is this 1 time step, and that's the only time step you get wrong, right? So only the change points in the expert action stream actually break this copycat shortcut. So if you think about the reward optimal policy that you'd like to learn versus this copycat policy that's learned through this kind of degenerate property of your behavioral cloning loss, then what happens is that the copycat policy has low training and validation loss, just like the reward optimal policy has. But the copycat policy, of course, has low environment rewards, while the reward optimal policy has high environment rewards. And the only sources of training error for the copycat policy are the change points. The sources of training error for the reward optimal policy, on the other hand, might be optimization related, because you're learning a much more complex function. It might be limitations of your model. It might be noise in the data. It might be stochasticity in the data, and so on, right? So how are we going to address this? Well, there is a very simple solution. The idea is to say we really can't make the reward optimal policy any more attractive. It already does have low training and validation losses for the behavioral cloning agent. Instead, can we just make the copycat policy less attractive, right? And again, the key here is to remember that the copycats fail at change points. And so the only way to make copycat solutions less attractive really is to artificially inflate the copycat errors by upweighting change points. So in other words, this behavioral cloning loss that you see over here is going to get updated to this new behavioral cloning loss that just has weights for individual samples, all right? And we, in particular, want to assign higher weights to the change points in our data. Okay, so then the question arises, how do we identify and upweight change points? Well, the solution, again, is very simple. We've already kind of foreshadowed this. The idea is to deliberately train this copycat policy that we defined, this optimal copycat policy that we defined. So in other words, you train a policy whose only inputs are past actions, and then train it with behavioral cloning, just like you would normally train your BC policies, right? So you deliberately train the optimal copycat policy. This, of course, is extremely inexpensive, even with really complex data, because all that you're doing, you're completely ignoring all the high dimensional state information in the scene. You're just taking past actions, right? So you might be, for example, doing this on Carla with photorealistic images and trying to learn visual imitation learning, but you can do this really, really quickly in just a few minutes on even a large data set, because the copycat policy in particular is extremely simple, right? And once you've done that, all that you need to do is identify the change points, which are where the copycat policy psi star has high error, right? And in particular, you can literally use the copycat policy's prediction mean squared error on every data point in your expert trajectories as your change point detection score. And we call this the action prediction error. It's kind of occluded behind this equation, but we call this the action prediction error, or the APE, which is simply the error of the optimal copycat policy. And so you can see a visualization of this, again, in the same kind of toy setting of stopping at a red light and then starting to move. Here is the cartoon copycat policy, which literally just repeats the previous action. This is, again, not the only case where the copycat policy might arise. You can have more sophisticated instances of depending on past actions, like extrapolating past actions forward and so on. But in this case, you'll see, for example, that the copycat action, which just repeats the previous actions all times, exactly deviates the most at the change points. Right? So the action prediction error is highest at the change points, where it comes to a break, or comes to a stop, or where it starts to move. So this agrees with our intuition that we should be able to upweight the important change points in the data. And so once we've done that, all that you need to do is replace the weights in this equation that we showed earlier with a function of the action prediction error from the previous slide, where the change points are higher, right? So F here in particular can be any monotonic non-decreasing function. We tried a step, we tried a softmax. The differences are kind of marginal, and it works rather well. So the overall method here is really simple. We're overcoming these copycat shortcuts in two simple steps. We simply train a copycat policy, and this takes just a few minutes, even on complex data like photorealistic visual simulators like Carla, and use its errors of the training data to then upweight samples for training a target BC policy. All right. Now let's look at some results. Before actually looking at the actual imitation results, let's see if our intuitions about the action prediction error actually match up. The first thing that we saw is that the action prediction error that we defined is actually a pretty good predictor of the baseline errors of doing behavioral cloning from observation histories, right? So in particular, the action prediction errors are plotted here on the top. Remember, these are the errors of the optimal copycat policy that we trained that pays no attention. It has no inputs even from the environment. It only acts on the previous actions. The errors of that policy tend to match really closely the errors of this blue line here, which are the BC from observation histories policies, right? And so that's exactly kind of what we would expect if we hypothesize that the behavioral cloning from observation histories fails because of this reason, right? And so we are indeed now able to correctly identify where the behavioral cloning from observation histories policy fails, and then upweighting them does indeed produce a policy that gets lower errors in those areas, which is this orange curve here, right? It gets lower errors because we are now able to say that we care more about getting these samples right on the expert data. Okay, so here are some results of actual imitation learning on various environments. We did this both on Carla for driving, where we are here reporting the success rate, but the trends are similar across all the other metrics that you might care about for driving, like collisions and so on. And we also report this in a variety of continuous control environments in Mujoko. And we find across all of these that our method performs significantly better, of course, than training from observation histories naively, but it also does better than a number of other competing methods. In particular, this problem has received some attention before, because as you might imagine, a number of people are interested in getting imitation learning to work well on autonomous driving. And the methods that they have proposed for addressing this problem have been much more complicated typically, and yet perform much poorly compared to this very simple upweighting scheme that we're doing. And really, there is no computational overhead really in this process. Again, on the Mujoko case as well, we are doing significantly better than the baseline, as well as additional methods that have been proposed for improving this problem or addressing this problem. You'll also notice actually that we're doing better than Dagger. Dagger, of course, is not a purely offline method. It involves actual online interaction with a queryable expert and so on. And we still actually do better than Dagger, even with 120K samples of experience in the environment, right? So, of course, all of this is actually down to an instantiation of distribution shift. The fact that you're doing poorly on the environment while doing well on the expert data is down to distribution shift. But the specific case of distribution shift that we've identified permits a pretty nice solution that's better than the online interaction that Dagger would require, right? Okay, and so really the takeaway from here is that simple change point upweighting like we've done improves behavioral cloning from observation histories and outperforms other more complex baselines. Okay, so here are some examples of videos of this method. And yes.
Maybe a quick question.
Yeah.
So in the previous, so when you're describing this change point method, it's a two-step process, right? So instead, if I was just to do boosting, right? So that would naturally upweight the points which have high error. So would that work as well, or would that be more computationally expensive? And that's why this, two-step process is necessary.
That is exactly what we thought as well, that if we repeated this process over and over, where we trained this BCOH approach with the upweighted samples, and then we repeated this process, that we would continue to get better results. We actually didn't observe that in practice. In fact, if you, I think our appendices report the results of boosting for several iterations, and we didn't manage to get improvements. But the intuition here is actually very similar to boosting, right? We're upweighting these change points. Yeah.
So could we just do like vanilla boosting, right, without doing the two-step process, right? Where, as I'm doing my, behavior cloning with some history, but I keep on, during the training, I keep on upweighting the points which have high error.
Yeah, you could certainly do that. I think that if I remember correctly, that method still actually performed worse than explicitly identifying the change points in this way. And of course, it is significantly more computationally intensive to do that. Training one of these visual policies, which is what you would have to do for boosting, one of these visual policies already takes something like a day to train. And so multiple rounds of boosting, or even 2 rounds of boosting, is significantly more expensive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So here are some examples of kind of scenarios that we were able to identify, mapping semantically to our intuitions for where this method should work well. So here is an example where the baseline method finds it difficult to come to a stop, because it is, of course, relying purely on past actions to continue moving forward in the environment. And where it fails to continue to a stop, it of course collides with the car. This is the same thing that happens in both of these cases. Whereas our method does indeed pay attention to the right stuff and come to a stop. Right? Here is another case where literally this is a problem that's been identified in the literature for the last 3 or 4 years and doesn't really have a convincing solution yet, which is a behavioral cloning policy trained on data like this. Literally, once it comes to a stop, it actually finds it difficult to start again. And so if you come to a red light, when the light turns green, you never start moving again. And this is kind of a really odd problem for imitation learning to have on these data sets. And we find that our method is actually able to address this fairly well. Right? Okay. So I want to, before moving on from this, I want to quickly kind of tease some new results that we've had that I didn't have the time to make a full kind of slide deck on. But I want to talk about it nonetheless, because I think there are interesting connections to the work that I just spoke about. So this is a setting that we call offline imitation. And the idea is that you're given offline experience, as well as some very limited expert data. And the expert data might even be from an agent that does not have the same embodiment as you. It might be different dynamics, etc. So for example, you could have expert data from an agent that's able to move diagonally, and all of your offline data only consists of agents that can move along the axes in a grid, right? And our solution to this that we derive is kind of very similar to the solution that we just saw. It basically amounts in the end to doing behavioral cloning on the offline data, but upweighting the correct subsets of the offline data. All right. And the correct subsets, of course, are kind of automatically identified here. And we use a kind of dice-based approach to do this that works very well. And we can show that it is actually able to approximate optimal state distribution matching between the target policy and the expert. And so effectively, given expert data like this and offline data like this, our output is learned behavior like this, right? But where it is able to, within the dynamics of the imitator, still learn the optimal policy that comes closest to matching the expert. And so it not only imitates mismatched experts from observation alone, it can also do example-based offline RL, where the idea is that given only goals from the expert, you can treat those goals alone, the goal states alone, as expert trajectories of length 1 that come from an omnipotent teleporting agent. So you can imagine that a teleporting agent just directly went all the way to the goal. That is also a special case, a particularly special case of a mismatched expert. And we find that we can actually do example-based offline RL just with the same method. It actually works better than the state of the art on a variety of challenging benchmarks. So this is a paper that we only recently put on arXiv. And I kind of really like the connection here between these two approaches that I just described. One coming from a very heuristic approach of just kind of looking at the data and trying to figure out what to do to fix behavioral cloning. and the other saying we want to do this optimal state distribution matching for offline data, and we arrive at basically a very similar looking solution. Okay, the next part of the talk is going to be kind of different, so this is probably a good time to break for questions about this. Yes, no.
So I have a question about, can you maybe talk about the difference between just weighting the difference in actions from only the expert data? So if you look at the expert data and you just pick out the places where the actions change a lot, and you weight it purely on the expert data changes, like, yeah.
Meaning that without, you're talking about the, not about this paper, but the previous paper that I spoke about.
The previous paper. Yeah.
So, yes. So, are you asking, are you asking compared to an alternative change point detection approach? Because really, what we're doing by training this Copycat policy and looking at its errors is effectively identifying these areas where the change points change, where the change points happen, right? And you could explicitly do this by using some kind of change point detection approaches, like time series analysis folks have for a long time been interested in change points, literally. And so they will have, for example, Bayesian change point detection approaches that try to identify when the distribution is shifting or something like this. Are you suggesting doing something like that?
Yeah, I guess so. And I don't know if there was a comparison or if you have any thoughts on where that would maybe fail.
Yeah, so we have actually tried something like that. I think this is also actually reported in the appendices of our paper, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But I do remember that it didn't work very well. So in particular, I think the intuition is quite simple. I think this notion of change points that we get by literally training the behavioral cloning agent that is limited to looking at past actions is exactly the problem that we're addressing. So there's a very specialized notion of change points to this particular problem. So a more generic notion of change points from the literature and off-the-shelf change point detection method doesn't quite do exactly this. And I think that's really why it fails.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so let me move on then to the next part of this talk. How am I doing on time? I'm at about 27 minutes. All right. Okay, so now I'll be talking about attending not to portions of your experience, but attending to portions of the scene. In particular, this is a project that we did recently and wrapped up that will be presented at ICLR on learning spatially disentangled models for model-based RL. The students that worked on this were Edward Hu and Kun and Oleg Rybkin. All right. Okay, so here is a quick overview of what model-based reinforcement learning does in a very cartoon picture. So suppose that you have a basketball player that's trying to throw his ball in the basket. Here is how the model-based reinforcement learning version of this would play out. You would first learn to predict the future states given actions. And in particular, if you're interested in visual tasks, you'd learn to predict future video frames given actions. And so you might, for example, throw your ball in a particular way and then identify the trajectory of the ball and gather a data set like that. The data set would then go into a machine learning system, and you would learn then to predict future video frames given actions. Afterwards, at test time, in order to throw your ball in the basket, all that you'd need to do is sample a bunch of different actions, and these different actions would each be kind of mapped to their corresponding predicted trajectories, and you could simply identify the ones that have the best predicted outcome and pick that one. Right? So this is a cartoon picture of what model-based reinforcement learning might do. But essentially, the idea is you want to learn predictive models from experience to assist in robotic control. So this has also been attempted in visual settings for some time now, starting from about 2015 or so. And so here is an example of one of the seminal papers from this field that was doing that learned a visual model for predicting future states of a cluttered tabletop and then learn object pushing with it. Now, prediction models are quite expensive to train. Visual predictive models in particular are quite expensive to train. They take up to a few tens of robot hours of data. So when I say expensive to train, I'm talking about the robot experience, right? And moreover, the difficulty here is that you must typically train them separately for every new robot, all right? So the question we try to ask in this work is, could we learn in some way transferable visual dynamics models and controllers? So in particular, we're going to set up the most extreme version of that problem where we train on one robot and transfer to an entirely new robot that we've never seen before. So as an example of that, you train on a WidowX robot. This is the experiment that we actually did, or the experiment that I'll spend most of the time on, where we train on one WidowX robot, which is this janky little low-cost robot that was sitting on my student's desk while he was away from the lab during pandemic. It's like a really compact thing. So it worked out quite well. And you can collect a bunch of data on it, gathering data where it is pushing some cluttered objects around on a tabletop. And we want to eventually test on the Franca Panda sitting in our lab, right? Okay, now the idea that we're going to use here that I'll briefly foreshadow before stepping into a more detailed explanation is we want to disentangle the robot from the stuff that we actually want to move in the world. So in particular, if you gather data like this from this robot that was pushing around objects, we're going to train a modular dynamics model. The modular dynamics model is going to have two components. The first component is going to be this robot dynamics. And the second component is going to be the rest of the world dynamics, right? So in particular, the robot dynamics are going to predict the next robot state conditioned on robot in action, and the world dynamics are going to be the rest of that equation, right? So if you just kind of decompose the probabilities. So this is a reasonable decomposition under some assumptions that we'll see soon. And once we've done that, then you can take the world dynamics model that you just trained and use it, plug it into a system for a completely new robot for performing optimal actions on it. In particular, for example, on the Franca robot, you might be given a goal image that looks like this and a starting image that looks like this. And what you can do then is use the same world dynamics model that you just trained, just plug it in with a new robot dynamics model that's specific to this robot. And we'll talk about how you can get that robot dynamics model soon. But once you've kind of plugged it in, then you now have the new combined dynamics model of the scene, even though it's a completely new robot. And then you can use a modified cost function for planning and execute tasks like this. All right. So let me, in the next few slides, start setting up the actual method. There are a couple of setup steps. The first setup step is just to segment the robot in the scene. This is, of course, easy to do when you have proprioception and camera calibration. So very often from your robot manufacturer, you'll have kind of the geometry of the robot that you're working with. And that together with camera calibration makes it really easy to just kind of back project the robot into the scene and get clean masks like this, even if your robot is quite noisy and doesn't quite have perfect proprioception and so on. In fact, even without that knowledge, we've shown in past works that it's quite easy to identify the robot in the scene. So you might just, for example, use the fact that you know which actions are being emitted by the controller, and you can then identify the portions of the scene that are best responding to those actions and identify those as the robots. You can do this both with kind of very primitive key points that you might get from a corner detector, or you can even do this with learned neural key points like I'm showing on the right here. Okay, and so you can do stuff like that. We stick to the first solution where we have this analytical dynamics model for the robot and or analytical segmentation mask for the robot, and you can see here that we can get reasonable masks for fairly complex looking data. Okay, and once we have the segmentation mask, the next setup step is to get the robot transition model. So remember that our decomposition of the overall dynamics of the observations was going to be the next observation given O, A, the current observation, action is going to be the robot dynamics multiplied by the world dynamics. And the robot dynamics are going to be obtained as follows. In particular, we assume that the actions A are end effector position or velocity specifications that are executed by a low-level controller. And with that assumption, what you can do is the analytical kinematics are already going to specify for you the robot transition model. Right? So in particular, you can do forward kinematics then to identify what is the next state of the robot conditioned on the previous state and a particular low-level control action that you've executed. So this assumes that the robot does not hit any immovable barriers, but this is an assumption that we very often make anyway, and it doesn't turn out to be too prohibitive even when it does hit barriers in our kind of empirical results. Okay, so this is now the robot dynamics that we actually plug into this decomposition over here. So now we have the robot segmentation masks and we have the robot transition model. And we are now ready to actually look at the first component of the robot-aware control method. Right? So the first component is the robot-aware world dynamics model. The way this is going to be trained is we take the world observation and mask out the robot. All right. Then we feed in the action which is going to be, again, end effector position displacements dx, dy, dz. And then we feed in the current robot state. In particular, we feed it in the format of a robot mask, just to make it easy for the neural network to learn the function. And given that we already know this term in our dynamics, we can then project the next state R prime. And we can feed that in as well into our world dynamics model. All right. And once we've done that, the world dynamics model is going to be asked to predict on the basis of all of these inputs. So OW, A, R, and R prime, just like we have on the conditioning side over here, it's going to try and predict the next observation, the next image. All right. In particular, it's going to be trained only on the portions of the scene that don't include the robot. It's going to be trained purely on predicting the state of the rest of the world. And we will then compare with some ground truth data that we have. Okay. And the important thing to note here is that this entire thing can be swapped out for another robot, assuming similar end effectors, as long as, and you can use exactly the same, world dynamics model as you trained with one robot. Any questions about this? Okay, the next thing that you can do then is you can construct an appropriate planning cost as well that goes together with this robot-aware dynamics model. The idea here is that you need a function to measure whether the predicted outcomes from a particular action plan do match the target images that you'd like to get to. So for example, you might be given a target image that looks like this, and you might have your current observation or a predicted observation that looks like this. Normally, you would measure a cost between these two images. You might do this in the pixel space even. We actually stick to pixel space experiments in this case, but you could do this in a more sophisticated learned space as well. But very often, you might just use a simple choice of a cost function that just measures the distance in the pixel space, literally between these two images. And this cost function, of course, wouldn't work very well because it's dominated here by the robot in the scene. Right? Instead, given the fact that we kind of know already where the robot is in the scene, we can just choose to ignore that. And so we can literally choose to measure only the cost between the rest of the pixels, masking out the robot. And that's what we do. Right? This is a robot-aware planning cost. And so you combine these two components and you get back the same picture that I started with. And our hypothesis then is that the robot-aware dynamics model, PW, and the robot-aware cost enable better prediction and control on new robots. Okay, so of course, the experimental validation of that hypothesis has to come in multi-robot settings. So we do evaluate this on robot transfer tasks. We work with a variety of different robots. Some of these are actually robots, but a couple of these are robots that are recorded in RoboNet. We don't really have access to these robots even, but we just use the offline data recorded on them for training policies and then for training models and then transferring to a new robot. And then we test for transfer to FrancoPanda and so on and so forth. So here is a particular instance of the experiment that I foreshadowed earlier, where we train with 2K videos on WidowX200. At this point, we're not even using RoboNet data. We have 2,000 videos on WidowX200, which take about a day to train or a day to gather. And once you've trained a visual dynamics model on that, we want to test for transfer to a FrancoPanda. Of course, this would be really hard to do for a baseline, and that's exactly what we find. When we train a baseline dynamics model to do this task, it basically does not succeed at all. It succeeds 0% of the time. It doesn't do anything particularly meaningful. In fact, very often, kind of an amusing behavior that we saw is if you fed in goals like this without any robot in the scene, which is a very reasonable goal specification, then the baseline dynamics model would just choose to retract the robot all the way out so that the cost that it incurs from having the robot in the projections is at least minimized, given that it doesn't know to do anything else. Right? Whereas the robot-aware dynamics model, the robot-aware method overall does significantly better. It gets to about 71% success. Now, you might ask, does this problem go away if we had more than one training robots? Right? And there have been several approaches that have been proposed in the last couple of years that have suggested that by collecting a large data set, it's possible to train more general dynamics models. We did try that as well. In particular, we augmented the earlier data set that we had for WidowX with RoboNet data. So we in particular had 80K videos from RoboNet together with the 2K videos from WidowX200. And again, we're going to attempt the same transfer task to Franca. Of course, the baseline model improves a little further now. It goes from 0% to 36%. But it's not quite at the point of our model. Our model also improves. It gets from the 71% earlier to 90% success. And you can see that it's doing significantly better. Okay, so even with multi-robot training, robot awareness in the way that we've implemented vastly improves the ability to transfer. We also do some experiments and simulation on more complex tasks, in particular for pick and place task that requires more precise control because you need to kind of correctly modulate the gripper length and the force, etc., to actually match with what is needed to grasp an object. And we find that, again, our method performs better, in this case, compared to a domain adaptation baseline that's based on cycle GAN. Of course, we evaluate all of this quantitatively as well, and we show that across a variety of different transfer tasks, that our method works consistently better. This is both in the single robot training case and the multi-robot training case for transfer to a completely unseen robot. So in particular, this also includes evaluations of the two different components of the robot-aware control framework, the dynamics model and the cost. And you'll see here that both of these methods, both of these components are necessary for transfer across robots. So the cycle GAN method in particular here is a pretty strong baseline because this has been suggested by several authors in the last couple of years also as a kind of good way to achieve transfer between robots. It is not quite the same setting as our method because it requires access to target robot images in advance, but that's a somewhat small concession to make. And so we did train on 12K target robot images, and we still find that it doesn't quite match the performance of our method. Okay, so here are some examples of actual predictions from our method, not just the control rollouts, but the predictions from our method. So you can see, again, compared to the baseline, that the baseline suffers from robot confusion. Oops, there's a typo here. It suffers from robot confusion. In particular, what it's doing very often is it's just replacing whatever robot is there in the scene with the robot it's seen at training time, which is the skinnier Widow X robot. And it also generally produces smaller object motions. In particular, you can see that the object motions that are being predicted here are much more conservative than the motions that are being predicted by our method. And it suffers sometimes from disappearing objects, like in this case, where the object dynamics are completely lost over time. Right. So this is, of course, not surprising, given that the baseline method does not work well. You would expect that the dynamics models are failing at some point. Right? So again, the robot-aware world dynamics models do transfer better. We can also visualize separately the robot-aware cost component. In particular, here is an example of a trajectory that's trying to execute this task. It does actually execute it correctly. But on that same trajectory, if you measure the planning costs between these individual images and the goal, if you just use the naive planning cost based on images, it is dominated by the robot in the scene, of course, whereas the robot-aware cost deliberately ignores the robot in the scene and therefore attends to the right portions. Right? So for example, here, you can see that it's primarily measuring the deviation between the current position of the object and the target position of the object. So the robot-aware costs do indeed attend to the right image regions. Okay, and of course, you also get improved plans with robot-aware control. Okay, so these are some examples of rollouts from the cross-entropy method for sampling action candidates and identifying good action candidates. And you can see that we get better candidates over here than on this column. So this column is the baseline dynamics, and this column is the robot-aware dynamics and robot-aware cost. All right, so another thing that you can do with this is you can do completely agent-agnostic goal specification, which means that you can even imitate, for example, a human-specified goal where a human is demonstrating an action. So in particular, we tried out a case where a human demonstrated how to push an object between two waypoints, basically. And a human-specified goal still works with the robot-aware framework, because all that you need to do is remove the human hand from the scene and you're set. And you can do this with any robot, right? And you can also, of course, do this with no agent goals. And again, you can do this with any arbitrary robot afterwards. You can execute the same task with arbitrary robots afterwards. Okay, and we also performed experiments in the few shot transfer case. I'm going to kind of skip this in the interest of time because I see that we're nearing the 50-minute mark now. And the takeaway here is that even in the few shot transfer case, the same robot-aware dynamics component works much better. Right? Okay. Are there any questions on these, or shall I kind of move on towards kind of the last little thing that I wanted to talk about?
So one thing, Dinesh, I'm curious about is like an alternative method to do this would be to do some segmentation of objects, right? And then maybe train on that. So I guess the reason for pursuing this is that, if we take mask RC and other segmentation methods, they don't perform well at all in these kind of viewpoint/diversity settings. And therefore it makes, a lot of sense to develop techniques which are able to automatically segment out the robot hand and then, leave the rest. Is that a good way to think about it, or?
I think it makes all the sense in the world to say you shouldn't stop yourself at only segmenting the robot in the scene. If you are able to indeed identify where the objects in the scene are that you care about, then you should try and do that as well. That of course is not always general. If you're doing fluid pouring, for example, to take an example of a task that you're interested in, right? This is not always possible to do, right? You don't actually have the state of the world encapsulated neatly in just a number of object detections. But that said, I do think that object key points are important. Objects and object key points are going to be important. In fact, this slide, as you might notice, actually has a little bit of foreshadowing of some work that we've done along that line. I think that when you can, if you have the ability to somehow either use off-the-shelf models or actually learn representations of your particular scenes and tasks that you're concerned with, to identify and represent objects, that you should definitely go ahead and do that, right?
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, okay, so this, like I was kind of just saying in the response, connects with a bunch of work that we've done before, in terms of generally trying to think about how you can abstract visual dynamics models in time and space, right? So this was an example that would fit more into the space category because we're focusing on the right pixels to pay attention to. But we have in the past, for example, worked on temporal abstraction, where the idea is to train a dynamics model that can select for itself which time instance in a trajectory to make predictions about. And this leads to interesting behavior, like identifying kind of bottlenecks or waypoints on the way between an input image and a goal. So given this input image on the left and this goal where this object is displaced to its left by a little bit, you can train a method that automatically learns to output this bottleneck state in between, even though the only thing that it's seen before, it's never been annotated for it that this is the bottleneck state. It's seen kind of an entire trajectory of the robot arm moving along some random path that involves getting in contact with this object and then pushing it to its left in some way, right? So it can automatically select that this is a good waypoint for this task. And that can be useful then for actually performing control, where, for example, there might be a compositional task that involves pushing two objects, pushing this object to this goal location and pushing this object to this goal location. And what you can then do is actually produce an intermediate waypoint that looks like this, where only this kind of hammer-shaped object is in its target position and the other object is still in its original position. And then you can plan in two stages rather than planning all the way over a longer horizon task. And we showed that it's possible to do well by kind of temporally abstracting the dynamics in this way. And we extended this afterwards. We got excited about this and extended this afterwards to kind of more sophisticated kind of method that wasn't just outputting a single waypoint, but actually producing the entire hierarchical tree, where it would select waypoints at first and then repeatedly, recursively generate more and more waypoints until it generated the entire sequence of actions. Right? We've also done, I showed some examples earlier, I foreshadowed this, where I said, you can identify robot key points automatically from just having very limited interaction. So in this particular paper, we showed that just from about a minute of interaction on a data, you can already reliably identify not just where the robot is in the scene, but also its different joints and which of its joints corresponds to the end effector, and so on and so forth. And you can do this even if the robot has been modified to include an arbitrary new tool that you might have, and you can detect that new tool as now being your new end effector, for example, and so on. And of course, if you can get key points, you shouldn't get them only on the robot. If you can get key points on objects, it tends to be very, very useful. In particular, we showed in work a couple of years ago that using object key points in this fashion can be really useful for imitating expert demonstrations involving moving an object. And we've also worked on learning object representations automatically from pushing objects around on a tabletop. So you might imagine a future version of the method that I just showed that involves combining the robot segmentation with kind of automatically learned object segmentation on the tabletop. We've also done things like abstracting tactile images for tactile manipulation, which look like this. Of course, I noticed Ed was on the call earlier, and many of you have probably seen these cool gel site outputs for tactile perception. You can take images like these, which tend to also, again, be quite hard to model because they're high dimensional and so on, and abstract them out. Given that you're working with a specific object, you can abstract them out into key points. And that leads to being able to learn much more sample efficient models and better control overall. Okay, so with that, let me quickly thank my collaborators and also mention the papers that I mostly spoke about. Keyframe focused visual imitation learning was what I spoke about in the first part. The transferable visual motor control through robot awareness is the second part. I briefly mentioned, overviewed the time agnostic prediction approach, as well as Jason's SMODIZE approach for learning offline imitation policies that also involve weighting behavioral cloning data. Okay, so the conclusions and the main takeaways from this that I want to leave you with are, it's very often the case that domain knowledge about tasks can be easily specified by saying what to attend to, right? So it's not only the case, even when we are trying to learn from data, we don't have to restrict ourselves to only having a data set of XY pairs. It's often quite easy to say just a little extra information about what to attend to. In particular, you could say that the non-robot areas in the first part of the talk, the non-robot areas are the most important for prediction and cost computation. That's a fundamental feature of many manipulation problems, that you mainly care about the portions of the scene that don't include the robot. And given then that you have the ability to actually detect the robot, that you should make use of it. Right? Or you can say that the change point samples are the most important to imitate the expert at. And so we showed that that's kind of useful for imitation learning and for overcoming a problem that's remained open for a couple of decades now, with these imitation learning from observation histories being surprisingly hard. The specific instances of these that we showed, this framework that we showed, is attending to the right things can induce invariance to the wrong things, which in turn enables generalization and transfer for visual model-based RL, for visual imitation learning, as well as for sub-goal generation by attending either to the right portions of the scene, or attending to the right training data, or attending to the right instance of time in your observation stream. All right, that's everything that I wanted to talk about. Thank you again.
Well, thanks a lot, Dinesh, for the talk. Now we have a couple of minutes for questions. So if anyone from the audience, wants to, ask something, now is a good time.
Thanks for the awesome talk. I just had a quick question regarding the first part. I was wondering if you ran into overfitting issues, when you were trying to do the change point detection, and how did you mitigate it? Because it's sort of like I think you said you drew some analogy to the boosting that Pulkit is mentioning. That's when you're wondering, since it's only dependent and you're doing empirical risk minimization afterwards, how much of overfitting do you actually see, and if that is an actual concern or not?
Are you concerned about overfitting in the Copycat policy that we're training to identify the change points, or are you talking about overfitting when we fit the upweighted training data?
I would say like a cumulative of it, if there were issues around that were fitting that arise, because I am not entirely sure. So your point is actually pretty nice, right? Like it doesn't really trickle down, and I'm wondering if it trickle down into the problem that you're concerned with.
Yeah, we didn't really see any cases of overfitting on the final objective at all. In particular, again, we repeatedly observed that the validation errors for all of these approaches do tend to be very good, right? So it's not the case that it's a matter of simple overfitting in the same sense as you learn in ML 101, where you're unable to generalize to other samples from the same distribution. It's always the case, rather, that you're unable to generalize to samples from a different distribution, right? That's really the problem that you're trying to address. So it's not a case of simple overfitting. And yeah, that's the reason that it's important to kind of inject some domain knowledge to be able to generalize, because generalizing out of distribution is kind of ill-specified unless you have some domain knowledge. And I think, again, of this kind of, saying that we want to pay attention to change points as a kind of domain knowledge that we're injecting into this to fix this problem. Does that answer your question, Akash? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the way I'm taking away is that I think even if there was overfitting, let's say, during the first stage, it doesn't really matter because the amount of information driven into the second part is sort of, it's like some sort of a bias or a prior that's getting, rather than, fitting to the original. So yeah, it does.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. So let's thank Dinesh for the talk once again. Thank you, Dinesh. So now we are at noon, so we should,